Hi, I want to return to the theme of metaethics and ask about the status of ethical discourse. I'm not going to be asking what we should do or what kind of people we should be or how we should go about deciding. I want to ask a question not within ethics, but about ethics. What are we doing when we engage in ethical discourse? When we call things right or wrong, good or bad? When we say something ought to be done or should not be done? What are we doing when we do all of that? There are a number of different ways of responding to that question. So earlier I've talked about this is a very basic question we might ask. Is moral discourse truth apt? That is to say, is it capable of being true or false? Is it the kind of thing that can be assigned a truth value? Another way to think of it is, are moral statements declarative statements? Are they assertions about the world or about something mind-dependent, about anything at all? Are they assertions that we could evaluate as true or false? If we answer that they are, we're in the area that is generally known as cognitivism. And we've seen there are a lot of different cognitivist views. You could hold, for example, that yes, they could be true or false, but they're always false. That gives you error theory or fictionalism. You could hold that they are at least sometimes true. And then we can ask true mind independently or true mind dependently. If we think they're truths but they're mind dependent, we're a subjectivist. A moral realist says there are at least some mind independent moral truths. Today I want to talk about the other side of this. What if we say no? What if we say, I don't think these things are assertions at all. I don't think they're anything like a declarative statement, even though they have that grammatical form, murder is wrong, that looks like the square is blue, but it's not like that at all. It's doing something very different. And it's doing something that we cannot evaluate as true or false. Well, if we take that line, what would we be saying? That sort of position is known as non-cognitivism. These things, in other words, are not really declarative statements. They're not making assertions. They are not appropriately evaluated as having truth values at all. What then are they doing? If they're not assertions, if they're not things we can evaluate as true or false, then what's happening with ethical discourse? We do say things like murder is wrong, or discrimination is unjust, or generosity is a virtue. Well, what is going on in such discourse? Think about ways in which sentences can fail to be true or false. There are different moods of sentences. So declarative sentences, things like, well, on its grammatical surface, murder is wrong, or generosity is a virtue, like this is a watch, or I'm a human being. Those are assertions. They can be evaluated as true or false. But there are other kinds of statements. For example, there are imperatives. If moral discourse does not consist in making assertions, well then what are we doing? Think about the different moods that are available to us in grammar. For example, yes, there are declarative statements, assertions like I am hungry, or this shirt is checked, or this is a marker. But there are others too. There are, for example, commands, imperatives. We might think then that moral statements that look like assertions are really commands. They're really imperatives. So if I say murder is wrong, I'm really saying don't commit murder. If I say generosity is a virtue, I'm really giving you a command, be generous. And so it might be that all of these are really hidden commands or imperatives. Imperatives in disguise, if you will. That sort of view is known as prescriptivism. Prescriptivism because it's saying what we're doing in moral discourse is telling you what to do, giving you commands, giving you imperatives. We are not describing anything, we're prescribing something. So the doctor might describe your illness, say you have COVID-19, and then might prescribe a combination of drugs to respond to the disease. And in that case, the doctor is giving a prescription, not saying here's what's going on, not making an assertion that could be true or false, but instead saying take this drug. Well, those aren't the only available additional moods in grammar. There are commands, but then there are also Interjections, or exclamations, in other words, these are things like ouch, or yes, or boo, or, well, all sorts of things that go along, alas, and so on. These are interjections. These are things that are expressions of emotion. And so there is a view that goes along with this. It is known as Emotivism. It was popular early in the 20th century. So according to this view, somebody who says murder is wrong is saying murder, boo. Or generosity is a virtue, generosity, yeah, go generosity. That's all that's happening, right? They're just expressing an emotion. That's one way of looking at what ethical discourse is doing. It's really just expressing emotions. It is just cheering or booing for various kinds of actions, various states of character, and so on. Now, those aren't the only possibilities. After all, there is another mood. This is kind of neglected in contemporary English, though it's a perfectly legitimate mood. It's called the hortative mood. And it consists of things like, let's do this, or, oh, that I had wings, I would fly away. Would that I had realized at the time what I know now. Those things express desires. And so there is a view that corresponds to this. It's often known as Expressivism. You might think of Emotivism, in fact, as a kind of expressivism. Emotivism is expressing an emotion. What are we expressing when we have this kind of view? Well, what would it mean, for one thing? Murder is wrong? Here it becomes something like, let's not murder. Or would that people would not murder one another. If we think generosity is a virtue, it would be something like, let's be generous. Would that everyone were generous. So these are expressions of, well, what exactly? Here there are different views. Some people say, well, desires. If I say, oh, that I had wings, I'm expressing a desire for wings, or a wish for wings, or something like that. If I say, would that I knew then what I know now, I'm expressing the desire or the wish that I had known then what I know now. But there are other things we might be expressing. Alan Gibbard, for example, in various versions of his view, has said, well, I'm not expressing a want or a wish so much as I'm expressing acceptance of something. So in one version of his view, I'm signaling acceptance of some norm. That would be something like, in other words, saying, I'll try not to commit murder. I'll try to be generous. Or, let me be generous. Let me not commit murder. That would indicate acceptance of a norm. I accept the norm of not murdering. I accept the norm of being generous. And so that would indicate something different. I'm expressing here not a want, not a wish, but rather an acceptance, a willingness to live according to a certain norm or principle. In another version of his theory, he said it's more like an intention. It's more like, I intend not to commit murder. I intend to be generous. And so it might be an expression of an intention. And presumably there are different versions you could give of expressivism, depending on exactly what you think I'm expressing. Am I expressing a desire or a wish? Acceptance of a norm or rule or principle? Am I expressing an intention of mine? Am I expressing, well, an emotion? Here we're expressing things, desires, acceptance, intentions. Probably there are others. I'm expressing something, but something that is still additional to all of these. There are a variety of questions you might raise about non-cognitivism, in whatever form you take it. One question is simple. What are we doing when we ethically disagree? One person says abortion is wrong, another says no, it's morally permissible. They're disagreeing, it would seem. And yet, well, here, if they're giving alternative commands, they're not exactly disagreeing, though I suppose somewhat. If one person tells you, open the window, and another says, no, close the window, they are giving you contradictory commands. Are they disagreeing? Well, not exactly. It's hard to say exactly what the relationship between those two commands is. If we think about this sort of view, what does disagreement amount to? Well, it would be a bit like the Red River rivalry, where Texas is playing Oklahoma, and the Texas fans are saying, "Texas, fight!" And the Oklahoma fans are instead cheering for Oklahoma. There's a sense in which there's a conflict between those attitudes being expressed, but it's not exactly a disagreement. It's certainly not a disagreement over facts, and it's not clear what one could do to resolve that disagreement. If somebody is saying, "Go OU," and somebody else is saying, "No, Texas, fight," I don't know how to resolve that. You can find out which team wins the game in a given year, but I don't know how to resolve the disagreement. And similarly here, if one person's saying open the window and the other saying close the window, how would we go about resolving that? You follow one or follow the other, but there's no such thing as, well, let's figure out exactly what to do. And similarly here, if I'm expressing a desire and you're expressing a different desire, oh well, nothing much to say about that. I'm accepting this norm, you're accepting that norm. That's something like, you say tomato, I say tomato. And it looks like there's no way to really resolve this. Similarly, if I say, I intend not to commit murder, and you say, I'm kind of okay with it. I don't have that intention. Oh well. How is that different from, I intend to write a philosophy paper? And you say, I don't intend to do that. That's fine. So in short, none of these give a great analysis, you might think initially at any rate, of what's going on when we disagree morally. There's another problem too, because the surface grammar of ethical discourse is declarative. It looks like we're making assertions. Murder is wrong. Generosity is a virtue. And we use that in linguistic constructions where only that makes sense. For example, I can say, if murder is wrong, then so is assassination. Well, that seems to make perfectly good sense. You're thinking, I see, assassinations are kinds of murders, so if murder is wrong, assassinations are wrong. Now, you might like that inference or not, think that's a true conditional or a false conditional, but it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, if I say, if open the window, then shut the door, that doesn't make any grammatical sense. It's not even a grammatical statement. Similarly, I can't really say, if Texas fight, then go Longhorns. What do you mean? That's not grammatical. You can't have an if and then follow that up with some kind of command or with some other kind of interjection. If alas, then boo. That doesn't make any sense. And so it's not at all clear how we actually can manage, if this is really what's going on, how we can make sense of constructions we use all the time. This is known as the Fraga-Geech problem, because it was Gottlob Frege and Peter Geech who pointed out the difficulty here. If we think any of these things are going on, then we have to explain how it's possible for these to enter into logical complexities of the kind that ordinary moral discourse does. There are elaborate theories of this. I don't want to say this is conclusive, but at least it's a serious problem. In summary then, the non-cognitivist says that ethical discourse is not the kind of thing that could be true or false. It's not making assertions. It's nothing like a set of declarative statements about the world or about anything else. Instead, it's like some other mood grammatically. It's a question of giving commands, or expressing emotion, or expressing desires, or expressing acceptance, or expressing an intention. It's doing something expressive, or it's giving a command. It's prescriptive rather than descriptive. It's not anything like a description of any realm of moral facts, whether those are mind-dependent or mind-independent. So this is a very different view from that of the moral realist, or for that matter, the moral subjectivist, or the error theorist or the fictionalist. It's saying we're doing something totally different, something that is not a matter of assertion at all when we engage in ethical discourse, and therefore when we engage in ethical reasoning, or in general moral judgments about the world, about actions, or about ourselves.